The Fellowship of the Ring is the first volume of The Lord of the Rings written by J.R.R. Tolkien. This famous work of fantasy tells the story of a hobbit, Frodo, who is given a ring of power. The ring belongs to the villain, Sauron, who is trying to get it back. War is coming, and the world of Middle-earth is threatened. Frodo and a fellowship of uncommon allies set out to destroy the ring in Mount Doom. Welcome to the 12th episode of the Two Retired Homeschoolers, and we want to welcome back our special guest, Mackenzie Matthews, from our Charles Spurgeon episode.
Thank you for having me.
And we're going to start out by going over some research we have prepared on it. So, first, on Tolkien himself. He was born in 1892 in South Africa, interestingly enough, and died in 1973 at the age 81 in England. His father passed away when he was only 3 years old, which is why his mother sent him and his brother to England. He became a professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford University and later became a professor of English and literature. He was a devout Catholic for the majority of his life, and after graduating from Oxford with first-class honors in 1915, he served in World War I as a second lieutenant. Also, no promo, but the Prancing Pony podcast is a great podcast if you're interested in Tolkien and his works. They go in a lot more depth than they will, so check them out if you're interested. And he became a friend with C.S. Lewis in the early 1920s. Which is interesting because I always thought that they became friends later on in life. So in the foreword to Fellowship of the Ring, Tolkien talks about his motive for writing it. He says that the prime motive was the desire of a tale-teller to try his hand at a long story that would hold the attention of readers, amuse them, delight them, and at times maybe excite them or deeply move them. He came up with Lord of the Rings as he was writing it, which is interesting. And it took 12 years for him to write and rewrite it because of his work, and he was going through major life changes, and the Second World War was happening during that time.
He was just a perfectionist in general.
That's very true. But he described the process as a continual pouring out of myself. Some interesting facts. So he was really fascinated by linguistics. He became practically an expert. Well, not even practically, he was an expert in it. And the elves in the story speak their own language, which he came up with. It's called, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, but Quenya, which was inspired by the Finnish language and other real-world languages, and also inspired by ancient mythology and folklore. Lord of the Rings won an International Fantasy Award in 1957. Peter Jackson's films on the trilogy won 17 Academy Awards, which is crazy, but also, totally deserved. Some other interesting facts: he wrote the entire story by hand, often while smoking his pipe, not unlike a character in the book. And the idea for the story came to him while he was grading papers, starting with, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." He originally intended it all to be one long book, but it was split into 3 volumes. The book was immediately a commercial success, which surprised Tolkien. He later remarked that he had created a new branch of plumbing in literature. There's always authors that come up with a new genre or a new way of putting things that inspires other books and kind of creates this little branch of writing. And I would say he was right in saying that he did that with Lord of the Rings.
I think he was one of the first to write fantasy the way he wrote it.
And The Lord of the Rings has been translated in over 50 languages and has sold millions of copies worldwide. And for those who don't know, Tolkien, what Rebecca was saying with him being a perfectionist, he did just tons of world building before he even attempted to write The Lord of the Rings. For each of the characters, for Middle-earth, the first age of the story was recorded in his book, The Silmarillion, which he never intended to publish. I don't think it was actually his son who did that.
No, he did intend to publish it. They just didn't publish it. When he was writing, after he wrote The Hobbit, they were like, we want more stories about hobbits. And he was like, I have this story about, like, this really sad, depressing biblical story about elves. Do you want that? And they were like, no, we want a story about hobbits. So he basically was like, I'm working on the Silmarillion. I'll finish that for you. And they were like, no, we want you to write The Lord of the Rings. So he wrote The Lord of the Rings instead.
Okay, yeah.
And then after
Yeah,
he
that's
finished The
right.
Lord of the Rings, he kept working on the Silmarillion. And because he was such a perfectionist, he never got it into, like, one streamlined single manuscript form. His son had to work really hard to create that out of the very drafts that his father had left behind.
Yeah, yeah.
Holly, have you read it before, and what are your thoughts?
So I know I'm a homeschooler and everything like that, but this is my first time reading Lord of the Rings. It's fine. I mean, I'd read The Hobbit before, so I feel like that counts for something. But yeah, I have not read The Two Towers and Return of the King. I've only read The Fellowship of the Ring so far. And I knew that Tolkien was an incredible writer, but I was absolutely blown away. It was, as far as world building goes, an absolute masterpiece, and he also has solid skills when it comes to like plots and characters. So it was very good, and I would not be completely honest if I were to say I was enraptured the whole time. He likes to include a lot of like technical geography, and like they headed south, but then there was this river that went north that they sometimes veered towards, and he would just go into paragraphs and paragraphs of that, and it was a little boring at times, but overall just very well done and high quality. The end.
That's awesome. Yeah, so I have never read this book before. I'm extremely familiar with the movies, so I was always constantly going back and forth between the book and the movie, like what I knew of the movie anyway. And actually, the movie made me want to read this series, so that's something. And it was specifically because during the movie in the Council of Elrond, I felt like they just rushed it. Like, I don't know why, but this time round, I usually watch Lord of the Rings like every year, but this time round that I watched it, I thought, this is really rushed, and it feels like there's more that was said that they just didn't include, and so I wanted to read the book, and sure enough, there was so much that there was a lot that was included and there was a lot that was excluded, and I think it was for sake of time. So here's some interesting points of interest that I found about the book that I thought were cool. So Frodo is actually 50 years old when he sets out on this journey. He's like 50 or 60, whereas in the movie he's portrayed as like, 20 or something. So that was odd to me. Also, apparently hobbits live longer than like, our race, like humans in like modern day. So I think, I don't know, he was probably in his equivalent of like our 30s, but yeah, so he was old. Next point I thought was interesting was that the Fellowship was always traveling at night and with no fires. Whereas in the movie, like sometimes they were traveling during the day and all this jazz, but it was always at night in the book and no fires because they didn't want the enemy to find them. And I just thought that was absolutely grueling and like something that I would never want to do in my life is just walk all night in the cold, no fires, all that. Anyway, also in the book, there is like a complete lack of romance anywhere, and specifically between Aragorn and what was the girl? What was her name? Arwen. Yeah, there was
I
like
noticed
nothing,
that too.
There was nothing in the book about it. I mean, like very, very little, and it wasn't even like, it was like a sentence of like they were standing by each other or something.
Yeah, so it doesn't qualify as romance.
It really made me wonder, like, clearly maybe Tolkien doesn't prize romance in his like writings. But anyway, so then there was I found it really interesting, the relationship between Frodo and Sam, because Sam is his servant and he very much wants to be Frodo's servant, and he's very proud of that fact, whereas in modern day America we think that he would be less than Frodo by being his servant. And so it was just really interesting to me to see that, and I'm sure it was different, like, a different culture when Tolkien was writing it, especially in London, but I don't know. So I just thought that was interesting that Frodo didn't want to make Sam his quote equal by being like, you don't have to be my servant anymore. You're the same as me. Like, I don't know. It's just interesting. And then I had 3 other points, which was Gandalf is way more impatient and easily annoyed in the books than in the movie. Like, the movie definitely portrays him as more patient and, wise. Well, he's still wise in the books, but he has far less patience. So he definitely, like, snaps at people, which I was like, whoa, that's different. Merry and Pippin have way more stage time in the book. There's, like, whole adventures that they go on. And also, there are so many songs in the book, like, so many.
And poems.
And I finally realized it's because the races in Lord of the Rings, some of them are, like, illiterate, and so they can't write, and so the only way that they can remember history and remember, like, important things is by, like, making a song about it. So I just thought that was really cool.
This is my 5th time reading Lord of the Rings. So when I first read it, I remember that I was kind of bored at the beginning, but I knew it would get better because I had already read The Hobbit, and I was bored at the beginning of The Hobbit, but I liked it by the end. So it took me a while to get into it, and then, like, there were definitely parts that just felt so long. But now that I've reread it so many times, I don't really feel that way anymore because I just enjoy it all so much. Because, like, the world building is so rich, and the characters are so interesting that you just kind of, like, settle into it, and you just are happy to just be there in the world with the characters. But that's only because I'm so familiar with it. I remember being bored with it when I first read it. I love several of the things you pointed out as differences, Mackenzie, is why I love the book more than the movie. I actually watched the movie first. I watched The Fellowship of the Ring with my mom when I was little, and it was like, whoa, this is so cool. And it made me want to read the book, but I didn't read the book for a while. But then I did, and I really like how Merry and Pippin have more time and are more, like, distinct characters. Like, Merry is, like, has his own personality of, like, the organizer, the one who teases people but nicely, and Pippin is, like, his, like, crazy self. Like, they're not just both kind of, like, the same one-note character. And I think I've heard that Ian McKellen, who played Gandalf in the movies, was sort of basing a lot of his persona on Tolkien himself. And I've heard, like, interviews of Tolkien talking, and he does sound like Gandalf. Like, the way Tolkien talked is the way Gandalf talks in the movies, which is kind of fun. And I feel like that might have something to do with why he's more patient in the movies, because Tolkien was a patient man. Gandalf in the books is not a patient man. I find Gandalf hilarious. He's one of my favorites. What else was I gonna... Oh, and the fact that Frodo is older in the book. I really actually like that, because it does kind of feel... I understand why they, like, cut time out of movies. Like, it's hard to show a passage of, like, 30 years between all these important events. Of course you would, like, just compress the time. But everything feels more like how it would actually go. Like, and it makes sense for Frodo to be the character who's, like, older and wiser and more mature by the time he sets out on this journey, because it really emphasizes, like, yes, he wants to go on an adventure or whatever, but, like, he's also settled in his ways. Like, he knows the cost of this adventure that he's going on before he decides to go on it anyway, and I just feel like it makes the themes of the book weightier. I don't know. I really like the book. I love all the poetry. I think it's beautiful. Like, it really rolls off your tongue if you say it out loud.
Ooh, yeah. I noticed that too.
Yeah. My aunt said about our episode on Tucker that I was a raving, slobbering Louis L'Amour fangirl, is what I sounded like. She didn't use those words. I feel like it's going to be even worse in this episode because I really, really love the way Tolkien writes. So, yeah, I just love this book.
Well, that is something that's cool that you bring that up, because that was something I also appreciated. I don't know if you watched any, like, of the newer Marvel movies recently, but they literally don't include details anymore because they're just always jumping to the next action point. And it's like a character changes into a completely different outfit. Well, where did they get those clothes? Like, who gave them to them, and what, and I really miss details in movies, and I care about them a lot, and I care about characters and like how they interact and who responded what way and why, and so I appreciated the book a great deal more because it went into those little nooks and crannies that I don't know someone like me cares about.
What did y'all think of the plot? Like, it is kind of crazy that Tolkien came up with it as he was writing it, as opposed to like mapping out beforehand, this is how it's going to go. But it works. I mean, if you have the world building elements all in place and you know how your characters are going to be, it works to do something like that.
It does. That's actually how I write. Whenever I map out a plot, I like lose interest.
Mm.
So I have to discover it as I go. I don't know if Tolkien was like that, but maybe he was.
Yeah, there's a quote where Tolkien's like, yep, often I was as surprised about a twist in the plot as the readers were. I think that definitely is the main advantage to writing like that, is it holds your interest because you don't know what's going to happen either. But the main disadvantage is like, what if you actually wanted to include this and now you have to go back and rewrite the plot to an extent that this makes sense, or there's a contradiction or something. So that's what I've run into in my experience.
Yeah, I really think that it's interesting the way he wrote it, because it was almost as if the story just needed to be written, almost like it already existed and it needed someone to like figure it out. Because I think J.K. Rowling kind of did the same thing with her writing, where she just got a sudden inspiration and she just started writing and writing and writing, and it like came to be. And it was based off of nothing. Like, she was just in a train on her way back home, and she was living a horribly depressed life, and a very hard life. And like all of a sudden it just came to her. And the same thing happened with Lewis. Like, he just saw a picture and all of a sudden all these things started like popping into his head. So I don't know. I don't know if it's destiny or fate or what, but it seems like some things just need to be written and then they hit people and then they write them or something. I don't know.
Creativity is very mysterious because you feel like you can control it if you like plan it out ahead of time. But actually, it's kind of just as mysterious that you could even think it up, especially when you come up with really good ideas. Like,
Yeah.
where do those ideas actually come from?
Yup.
We don't really know.
That's totally true.
Yeah, that was another thing Tolkien said I found was interesting in one of his interviews. He was saying no one really creates anything original. We're just taking what the creator originally made and rearranging it. He called it subcreating.
He has a whole essay called On Fairy Stories where he talks about that concept. And there's this quote from it that I love, and I cannot quote because it's long and I don't have it with me. But he's basically saying, like, if you study all these stories, you'll get so, and you want to write your own stories, you can become very discouraged because you'll feel that, like, you can't create anything original, and no matter how amazing of a thing you create, it's just one leaf in the litter on the forest floor under the tree of tales, as he said. But the thing is that just because, like, and because he was using a tree metaphor, he was basically saying just because spring comes around and this tree puts on its spring finery and is beautiful, and just because that happens every year doesn't mean it's not beautiful every year. There will be like, this spring will be the first spring someone has ever seen. This beautiful arrangement of the leaves will be the first one that some person in the world has ever seen and will awaken them to, like, the beauty of
That's
spring.
interesting.
Yeah, and so that's how stories are too, which I just love
Yeah,
that.
it's a good analogy. What do you all think about the character development? Because I've heard before that, like, oh yeah, Tolkien's good at world building and all that, but his characters aren't even that interesting, and he doesn't develop them super well. Like, for instance, the character Legolas, some people think he doesn't have much of a personality at all in the book.
Yeah, I can see
I
that.
am so sorry, but choosing Legolas is the worst example because he's the character. Like, okay, first of all, Legolas has something of a personality, but he's like the character who does the least. That's cherry picking to make your argument that he doesn't have good characters because he has amazing characters, in my personal opinion, and I don't like when people say that he doesn't. I think that he's good at drawing them, he doesn't like spend paragraphs telling you all their inner thoughts, but he doesn't need to because he can still draw them. He can be much more economical with how he draws his characters, but that doesn't make them less interesting or less deep, honestly. And they do grow and change, which we'll see as we go further through the book, obviously. We're only in the first third of it, but like Merry, the Hobbit, I love his character arc. It's like one of my favorite things in
Well,
fiction.
yeah, and also one of the things I appreciated about his character development is almost the lack of him drawing conclusions for the reader and being like, yes, now Gandalf, he has anger issues. He's very wise, but he has a little bit of a temper. And then Boromir, he's very rash. Like, he doesn't say stuff like that or even describe them physically in a way that would make you think, I bet this is what their personality is like necessarily. He more just values consistency with character development, and you learn more about the characters because their respective reactions are very consistent with how they would say things.
What do you think, Mackenzie?
I think that's such an interesting question because if you were to just say character development, I really wouldn't think of anything until like the second book, which I've just finished. Mm-hmm. So like the first book is a lot about like just setting up who they are as people. And then once they get into like the real trials and challenges, you kind of start to see how they would handle those. And so I guess in that sense, there's character development. And there's definitely like just side characters who are characters, but he doesn't develop them, like Elrond. And I mean, I'm only in the second book, but so far Legolas has stayed like the exact same all the way through. And Aragorn, you are given a clue into his world about the things that he personally struggles with. For instance, he has this fear of being like his father, who became corrupt by power. So, I think there's like problems that each of them deal with. So, I mean, I think there's definitely character development, but it's probably too subtle and too slow for people to be like, yes, definitely this I don't know.
Well, and here's a good example of it. I have this quote that I absolutely loved as an example for good character development because it is very subtle. There was no sound but the sound of their own feet, the dull stump of Gimli's dwarf boots, the heavy tread of Boromir, the light step of Legolas, the soft, scarce-heard patter of hobbit feet, and in the rear, and slow, firm footfalls of Aragorn with his long stride. So that's just like one example. I don't know, that sentence just really stood out to me.
Wait, how is that character development?
Because he's talking about how each of these characters walk in this group.
Oh!
Like, who like, ever goes into something like that?
I thought y'all meant character development as in, like, they had some problem in themselves and then they, like, learned how to overcome it.
Oh. Yeah, that is a different...
I think that's what character development is, and we were kind of mixing the topics of character development and just characterization.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Makes sense.
I think that example of yours, Holly, is a very good example of characterization.
Sure.
In very few words.
Yeah.
I just object to the charge that the characters are flat. Like, whether or not every character develops, every character feels well-rounded and real. Well, at least except the very basic side characters, right?
I haven't found a character yet that I find boring, so...
That's how I feel too, except for a couple of the elves I do kind of think are boring.
Oh, what did you say, Holly? Prose? What is prose again?
Yeah, so I'll just pull up the definition for any of our listeners who might not know it. Hold on. Okay, prose is the written or spoken language in its ordinary form without metrical structure.
Oh, great.
So,
clear now.
Basically, it means the writing style.
So, Tolkien is not my favorite author, but I admire him deeply. And he's one of my, like, most respected authors on my list. And beyond just the world building, which I think is his main strength, what I like most about his writing is the prose. Even though I said earlier, yeah, sometimes it's a little boring because he goes into tedious geographical descriptions and stuff like that, and references to history especially. Like, he's a legend when it comes to using words in ways that you would never think that they would fit together, or just saying this thing and it's like, okay, I know what you meant by that, but that might not be what it actually technically means, but you go with what you think he meant by that. And it's magical. I love it.
I love his prose. I think it's beautiful. Because he can be really poetic, and also, like in some of the chapters with the hobbits and stuff, it's very funny the way he says things, but like very slyly so. Like you're just reading along, and the way he says it, you're like, oh, that was funny. I don't know. Let me read you a paragraph. Soon the white form of the lady was small and distant. She shone like a window of glass upon a far hill in the westering sun, or as a remote lake seen from a mountain, a crystal fallen in the lap of the land. Then it seemed to Frodo that she lifted her arms in a final farewell, and far but piercing clear on the following wind came the sound of her voice singing. But now she sang in the ancient tongue of the elves beyond the sea, and he did not understand the words. Fair was the music, but it did not comfort him.
Wow. Yeah.
That's just so pretty. I don't know. I love how he strings words together.
Yeah. I also have a quote that is a lot like yours because it's also about Frodo listening to elves singing. But this was of all the book, this was what I think my favorite part was as far as prose goes. So, at first, the beauty of the melodies and of the interwoven words in elvish tongues, even though he understood them little, held him in a spell as soon as he began to attend to them. Almost it seemed that the words took shape, and visions of far lands and bright things that he had never yet imagined opened out before him, and the firelit hall became like a golden mist above seas of foam that sighed upon the margins of the world. Then the enchantment became more and more dreamlike, until he felt that an endless river of swelling gold and silver was flowing over him, too multitudinous, I practiced that word but it failed me, for its pattern to be comprehended. It became part of the throbbing air about him, and it drenched and drowned him. Swiftly he sank under its shining weight into a deep realm of sleep.
He pays attention, I think, to like the music of words, like how they sound, not just what they mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me it's the same in the way that he describes things. One of the things that I use to mark who's like a good writer and who's not, like to me, is if they make you feel like you're there, or if they make you really like, yeah, actually, basically, if you feel like you're there. So, one quote I feel that really explains this well is this one. Sam was standing by the pony, sucking his teeth and staring moodily into the gloom, where the river roared stonily below. His desire for adventure was at its lowest ebb. I love that just so much because, sucking his teeth and staring moodily into the gloom, and even the river is roaring stonily below, like everything just gives you this idea of like, I don't want to be here. I'm tired of adventure. Like, I could care less about any kind of fame, jewels, or anything. I don't care about elves anymore. Like, I'm just done. I want the comforts of home. But yeah, that was one of Tolkien's things that really impressed me. So yeah.
And the last thing we have for Tolkien's writing is allegory versus applicability, as Tolkien defines it. And
he hates allegory. He thinks that his stories have nothing to do with it. He's detested it since he first knew what it was. I'm literally paraphrasing his words. He hates allegory. And basically, if you're wondering what allegory is, it's basically like Jesus's parables, where you have like a point in a story and you're using other things to describe it, and then people come to the understanding of it like afterwards. So basically you're using a story to illustrate points, almost as if you were preaching to people. But he just wanted his books to be pure story. He didn't want people to think that they were being taught at or preached at, or that they needed to like figure out a certain moral through them.
How Tolkien says it himself. He says, this is just one line, I think that many confuse applicability with allegory, but one resides in the freedom of the reader, and the other in the proposed domination of the author. And the way you described allegory, so I kind of want to draw a distinction.
Go for it.
On one end of the scale is applicability, which is what Tolkien does, right? Like, his only intention was to write a good story. Any moral intent was not written into it, but he's happy for the reader to draw it out themselves, right? And then on the other side of the scale is didactic writing, which is like, there's moral in this writing, and not only do I want you to draw conclusions from it, I'm going to tell you, like, here is the moral of the story, right? And then somewhere in the middle is allegory, which C.S. Lewis did a lot with the Chronicles of Narnia, where it's like there's moral intent.
Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is like a good example of an allegory.
Yes. There's moral intent written into it, but the author does not draw the conclusions for the reader.
Well, I would say, okay, I think of allegory a little different, like more like there's a moral intent in the Lord of the Rings, like, power corrupting, the importance of mercy, the importance of free will. Like, those are all even explicit themes in the Lord of the Rings. But I would say that there is no one-for-one correspondence with some other story or other real-life event. Like, I think the comparison he drew was people wanted to interpret it as like, oh, this represents the Nazis, and this represents when they took over France, and this represents them killing the Jews, and whatever. And he's saying, like, no, I don't like when stories do that. I don't like having that, like, double storyline, like the explicit storyline and the implicit storyline, which is what he's defining as an allegory, I think. It's not exactly the same as him not having any moral that he wants to get across, because I do feel like the whole Lord of the Rings is kind of a very strongly moral story in that, like, you cannot dominate other people's wills, whether you mean to do it for good or not, it will turn to evil. Like,
and good versus evil, basically.
Yeah, it wasn't until I did research into Tolkien that I realized this whole allegory thing was like a huge issue to him and other people at the time. And I was like, well, what's the big deal? And then I researched allegory. I actually did a bunch of research into this because I was reading Lord of the Rings and I'm like, what are you talking about? There's allegory everywhere. In the simple sense of the word being using something to describe something else or to help you understand the point of something else, because that's the most simple definition of the word. And I was just like, there's allegory everywhere. Why does he hate allegory? He's using it. And that's when I realized, after I did a bunch of research, that there's a bunch of different types of allegory. Like, there's not just one kind of allegory. There's different types. And so, I don't know. My end conclusion to it all was what you were saying, Rebecca, where he absolutely believes in, like, morals, and there are points he wants to get across, and like he does have truth and he does have wisdom that he wants to share through these stories. And there's another quote of his that is pretty famous where he says that he didn't mean for there to be like inherent religious themes in his work, but upon revising it he found that there was like a lot, and he was like, it was unconsciously done, but after editing it was consciously done. So, and that's a whole thing that, that's like a whole other topic we could talk about, but definite themes he wants to get across, but he doesn't like shoving it down people's throats. He likes them to put things together.
Yeah.
He actually hated Disney. He and Lewis went to watch a Disney film and they both ended up disliking it, and he like passionately hated it. He passionately hated a lot of things. Like, he didn't like industrialization.
He did. He was a very passionate person.
He was a little like, how would you say it? People call it eccentric because that's the nice word, but I think he might have also been like slightly cuckoo in some of his thinking. Like, he was completely against the Industrial Revolution and any form of advancement of technology, because he just thought it was purely evil, and like, it's not. It's very much how you use it, but
also, like, you have to, like, yes, he is more, I mean, I like machines more than Tolkien does, but if you think about the fact that, like, he grew up in a pre-Great War England, and then when he was a young man, he went to this war where millions upon millions of soldiers died in, like, trenches, and there was, like, no man's land, swept bare by, like, the creation of the Industrial Revolution. Like, technology had advanced to the point that they were able to weaponize it in a way where they killed so many people and made the land, like, desolate. Like, it was a horrible experience for him, and he lost all but one of his closest friends. And so to him,
makes sense.
That's what people did with the power that they gained by the Industrial Revolution. Like, that's what they did with the power.
I can understand how he came to his conclusion, but it was still wrong. In my opinion.
Yeah.
And I don't hate Disney either, you know. I don't like a lot that they put out now, but you know. Anyway, we should probably move on to themes.
Yeah, don't get us started on the Rings of Power. Okay, themes. So comfort versus adventure. I don't have much to say about this other than he wrote the conflict within the characters very well, both in Sam and in Frodo especially. I feel like because they both grew up in the most pleasant place on earth, basically, the Shire, which is all coziness and fires and food and gardens and hobbit holes. And then they're going out on adventures, and you see Frodo before they go out, and he's wrestling with. He's like, I want to go on an adventure. I want to be like Bilbo and have my own stories to tell. But also, I'm already like 50 something and I kind of like where I'm at. But also, I'm like 50 something. I need to get going on this. So,
Don't you think it's interesting that, like, they really did grow up in almost a perfect place? Like, just the most wholesome, wonderful place to live. And yet they still had that desire to go out on adventures.
yeah.
I think he was illustrating the beautiful paradox in humans where we have a need for comfort and we also have a need for adventure. And we have a fear of the unknown, like a huge fear, and it's in everything. But it was really interesting to me as I read the book because I could see these two rising up in my life at every point. And especially with the elderly. Like, the elderly are so much like hobbits. Like, they just want comfort. They don't want anything different. They want things to be the same, you know? And I think there's personalities, you know, there's young people who are just like that. And there's young people who just live for the adrenaline rush.
Yeah, I think the conflict of, like, wanting the comfort and wanting to go on an adventure, it probably the amount changes throughout your life, but I've definitely, like, that conflict, I have that in myself, and I always have. And okay. I also love that he's like, they always want to go on adventures in the fall. The fall is totally the time of year when you feel like adventurous, and you're like, okay, I'm tired of just going about my daily rounds. I want to, like, go climb mountains, or, you know what I
You
mean?
know, that's true.
Like, the fall is the season.
Wow. And I think to a certain extent, the spring a little bit. But I thought it was interesting in the book that, okay, so in the movie, like, Gandalf talks to Bilbo or Frodo, and then they just head right out after they figure out their plan. But in the book, it's like Gandalf is gone for months, and then he comes back, and then he's gone for years, and he's like doing all this like mystery solving and trying to figure everything out. And then he gets delayed. He was actually taken prisoner by
Saruman.
no. The other wizard that went bad.
Saruman.
Oh, you're right. My bad. Sorry. And so he's late in telling Frodo, and so Frodo's like, well, I guess I'll just head out now. And it's literally like the night that the Nazgul start like searching for him in the Shire. And then they follow him all the way to this other place that he had a plan for. Like, Frodo had a whole plan. And he was just waiting for Gandalf to come so he could set out. And Gandalf still hadn't told him really important things like, oh, hey, the Nazgul are coming and they're gonna hunt you. And so he leaves like super late. And then he like goes off by himself, and then they're waylaid by the Nazgul. And all right, so I guess that's that for comfort versus unknown.
Okay, duty and courage.
So I think courage was what kicked Frodo into actually doing this whole ridiculous thing where he like thought he was gonna die, you know, going to Mount Doom if he ever made it there, because he knew like his home was gonna perish, and the world that he knew was gonna perish, and the world of all the races of Middle Earth would perish. And so,
but he doesn't start out with an abundant amount of courage. He like learns, and it grows as life gets harder for him. And it's shown by even his physical appearance.
He realizes that he has to do this, so, like, whether he has the courage or not, he feels that he has to do it. I think that, like, it's like that C.S. Lewis quote, courage is the I'm not doing it right, but the one about how courage is the form that all the virtues take at the testing point.
Huh. I'd never heard that. That's interesting. It was especially interesting at the Council of Elrond to learn the motivations for why each of the people who chose to joined, which was something I don't think you totally
Uh-huh.
grasped in the movie. But they each had complex reasons for joining. Not all of them were
Yeah.
benevolent, I guess. I mean, most were, but.
Okay, when they're setting out, Elrond like tells them stuff and he basically says like he says only on the ring bearer, Frodo, does he like actually tell him you have to do this. And he says to everyone else, the further you go, the less easy will it be to withdraw, but you don't have to go any further than you want to. And Gimli, the dwarf, is like, faithless is he that says farewell when the road darkens. Maybe, said Elrond, but let him not vow to walk in the dark who has not seen the nightfall.
Hmm.
And there's also a bit where the little hobbits, Pippin and Merry, went to go, and Elrond is like, no, like if you knew how bad this will be, you wouldn't want to go. And Gandalf is like, yeah, if they knew how bad, they'd be too scared to go, but they'd still want to go. So, and be ashamed of being so scared. So we should kind of trust to their friendship instead of their small stature. And I really like that because I guess I just feel like it's sort of an illustration of like you have to do what you can at the moment and you don't know what's ahead and you have to just do your best with what you have. And like your courage will grow as you exercise it. And it does for everyone. But like Elrond is like, I'm not going to make you promise to do something that may end up being too hard for you. I don't know. I don't know if this is making sense. I just,
Yeah, no, it was very merciful and like understanding that like some people like you don't want to totally commit to something. Like I don't know. I was going to say you don't want to commit to something that you're not fully aware of. Kind of like when you sign a contract, you want to be fully aware of what you're getting into before you say yes. Um and
mm-hmm.
so he was leaving room for different people's capacities for danger, or like maybe some of them had families and they were like, I at some point they were like, I want to go back to take care of my family, like, or like whatever. And I also wrote down the quote that faithless is he that turns back when the road gets dark. I wrote it down because it reminded me of the Bible verse of um well, what Bible verse was it? I'm blanking.
Don't turn your back when your hand's on the plow. Something like that.
No, it was like following Jesus, like taking up your cross daily,
Yeah.
and following him into the darkness, kind of a thing. Even though he'll help you get through it. I guess that's not a Bible verse, but whatever. we should, yeah, we should probably move on to the next one. So we are going to talk next about the last theme, which is objects and power
Yes.
in the Fellowship of the Ring.
This is just something I brought up because I noticed in The Hobbit, there was the Arkenstone, which had a lot of power, and then in Lord of the Rings, it's obviously the rings that have the power. And, this is nothing new to literature. That's a concept that has existed, but it seems like Tolkien likes to use that quite a bit. And I wonder if that has anything to do, this is kind of a side note, and it may be completely inaccurate, but Catholicism, like, it seems that Catholics place
sacramentality.
more emphasis on objects than the rest of the denominations of Christianity. So, I don't know.
I've heard Catholics say that like the bread, which I don't know if it's even in this book, but the bread that the elves give them to eat and it never goes bad and it always refreshes them or whatever is like similar to the Eucharist.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
But I also think it's just useful because he is a very moral writer. Like he's interested in the morality of things. And The Ring, for instance, is a super good way to talk about in story form the nature of evil and what evil does to people and what temptation does to people. And because you place it in an actual physical object, you can sort of talk about it in a different way, which I feel like is kind of the power of fantasy to some extent. That you could talk about real life things, but put them in this different setting where you can make things take actual physical form that are only metaphysical concepts and stuff. And it's just a new way to talk about it and can be very
Let's
useful.
talk about that. Yes, I have so much to say about that. So, you know how the ring is called the Ring of Power? Well, it took a podcast, me listening to a podcast, to finally make that connection. The person in the podcast was like, basically, the ring itself represents power. And so when you have power, the longer you have it, the more difficult it is to give it up. And so when Gandalf says, "Oh no, like don't give me this ring," he, in all of his wisdom and all of his goodness, knows himself enough to know that he would be corrupted by the power. Gandalf knew that power would corrupt him. Aragorn was too afraid of the power corrupting him, so he didn't even let himself, get tempted with it. And so just that notion.
Same for Galadriel.
Yeah. To a certain extent, they have power. Aragorn, Gandalf, Galadriel, they all are extremely powerful people, and they're handling the power that they have quite well. So that makes me wonder, philosophically, a lot of us out there want to be famous, and I bet you God knows how much power we could handle before we would become corrupt. And I think perhaps maybe it's a skill you can get good at with handling power, or maybe it's something inherent, or maybe it's both. But I just thought, man, yeah, and so if you think about it, if you were to suddenly get rich, you would be terrified of losing the money. So, things that are precious to you. Haha,
Yeah.
precious, the ring. So anyway, that was just some really cool connections that I made. And I often wonder now how much power I can handle. And perhaps I shouldn't wish for it.
Is it also kind of like an addiction, maybe?
Yes.
Like Saruman, he had so much power, and then he just wanted more, and that's why he fell and wanted the ring and
an
stuff.
addiction to power. For sure. So I bet you power is sneaky, and it's in all kinds of stuff, and we just don't even realize it.
What I liked about it is just how creative he was with it. Like, we brought up the rings and the Arkenstone as an example, but also the cloaks that the elves gave them that keep them warm in the cold and cool in the warm. That was creative. And the elven boats they gave them too that could not sink. Just like, I don't know, he was always coming up with these little things that it's like, wow, that's kind of brilliant. I would never have thought about that. And yeah.
And I was thinking about it, and he does that in like all of his stuff. Like in The Hobbit, there's the ring and there's the Arkenstone, and in Lord of the Rings, there's the cloaks and the boats and the ring itself and the 3 rings of the elves and stuff. In one of his short stories, Smith of Wootton Major, the boy eats a star in a cake, and it was a magical fairy star, and it gives him a passport into so now like fairies or the fairy know, so he can like go into the lands of the elves and wander there freely because of the star. And in Farmer Giles of Ham, even, which is like a comedy, it all gets kicked off because he finds this like old sword of legend called Tailbiter that was made to fight dragons. And in the Silmarillion, it's all about the 3 Silmarils. Like, literally the whole plot hinges on this like self-destructive family of elves having forged these amazing jewels that they must keep. I don't know, he does that in like everything he's written that I can think of. So it really is a big thing for him, even if he's not always saying the same thing with it.
For sure.
Right. And even when Galadriel gives Frodo the little, when she was giving them all gifts, and she gave him the little glass vial, and she was like, call upon this.
The Star of Arendelle, I love that one. That one's cool.
Yeah.
Hang on. There was one last thing I just put together about the comfort versus the unknown, which was the first one, which is that I think the journey of Frodo and the call to adventure and the whole unknown versus comfort. I think if you're a Christian, God calls you to adventure and he calls you to the unknown. Because there's this quote that I love that says, growth can't happen in the comfort zone. Like, you have to get out of your comfort zone in order to grow. And so I think, and not that comfort is a bad thing. I think there's absolutely a time for comfort and, you know, the things that make you feel safe and all of that. But I absolutely think that if you're following God, he wants you to be in his adventure novel and to be an adventure novel yourself. So anyway, that's just what I want to say.
Yeah.
I think that God has different callings for different people and different callings at different times in their lives. And I have a lot of friends that I've talked about it or heard talk about it. They have a very great appreciation for like domesticity and like being a stay-at-home mom is great and like being content where you are is great. And it really is. Like that's important. But at the same time, you can disguise apathy and fear and being unwilling to answer God's call as contentment. You can say, I'm being content, I'm practicing contentment, and actually, like, you're supposed to go out of the Shire and cross the mountains. You know what I mean? Like,
for sure. I love that.
Yeah.
Dope. Well, let's move on to what was it?
Favorite quotes or moments or characters.
Well, let's do quotes first then.
Okay. I think I got mine memorized. It was a quote from Gandalf, and he said, "He who breaks an object to find out what it is has stepped off the path of wisdom."
Oh, yeah.
I don't remember reading that. Where was that?
He says it to Saruman.
Oh, wow. How interesting. Okay, well, I had a couple quotes. So the first one is, all that is gold does not glitter. Not all those who wander are lost. The old that is strong does not wither. Deep roots are not reached by the frost. And this was, I don't know what you would call it, but like a mantra of Aragorn's. I think it's had something to do with his family, and or it was like a prophecy about him. All that is gold does not glitter. I think it was a prophecy about him, or along those lines. And this is just part of it. There's like a whole other half. But I loved that because you see the whole, not all those who wander are lost are everywhere on pillows and like Marshalls and Ross. And you're like, oh, wow, like where did that first come from? Well, it came from Tolkien. So there you have it.
Do you guys, really quick, do you guys say Tolkien or Tolkien? Because I've always said Tolkien, but I guess Tolkien might be more correct.
I have no idea. I just say things the way I say them.
Legolas or Legolos?
I say Tolkien, but I hear like fancy British people saying Tolkien, but I think it sounds funny, so I say Tolkien. My favorite quote is Frodo talking to Gildor, who is an elf. Gildor was silent for a moment. I do not like this news, he said at last. That Gandalf should be late does not bode well. But it is said, do not meddle in the affairs of wizards, for they are subtle and quick to anger. The choice is yours, to go or wait. And it is also said, answered Frodo, go not to the elves for counsel, for they will say both no and yes.
Yeah, I love that part.
I remember that. One last quote I loved was by Gandalf, and he said, despair is only for those who see the end beyond all doubt. We do not. And that was one of the huge themes of the book, was hope versus despair. Mm-hmm. And Gandalf was always saying, have hope. And that's just been, I don't know, touched me personally, because that's a challenge that I have faced in my life. And it's very true. Those who despair believe that they know how the end is going to be, but you never do know. So, and that's what Gandalf is trying to really hammer in. So I loved that Tolkien knew that, and that he believed it, and that he wanted to share that bit of truth with other people. So, the end.
Yeah, that's really good, kids. Okay, favorite moments.
I'm just going to state for the record that I love Lothlorien.
I was literally about to say that.
Yeah. And okay, one thing I don't think I mentioned earlier, and it's actually one of my favorite parts of like the whole, not just the Fellowship, but the whole Lord of the Rings, is the chapter Fog on the Barrow Downs, because that whole chapter is not in the movies at all, and I love it so much. Like it's one of my favorite things. It's so creepy. Barrow Downs are the places. So the downs are burial places. They're mounds in the ground where like kings of old times were buried. And the Barrow Wights are like, I don't know what they are, but they're like evil spirits or something that live in the mounds and make them dangerous, and they're enchanted and stuff. So when the hobbits are like wandering across the Barrow Downs, which is like the fields full of mounds, um, they accidentally get caught by a Barrow Wight, all except Frodo, and then he gets caught too. It's so scary. Like, you don't know what this is, but it's just so scary.
Yep.
The Barrow Wight to me.
They were like real creepy.
I know. And like when it like stands up against this, or Frodo sees there's nothing, he can't hear his friends, and then a great shape stands up against the sky and blocks out the stars or something. Oh, and like speaks in a voice that's like as cold as the earth. I don't know what he said, but it was just, this is creepy.
So, okay, that was something I loved about reading the book. Because I really appreciated reading the book for the first time and only ever watching the movie, because I was excited about reading the things that weren't included in the movie. And that was absolutely one of the parts. And so, you know, the scariness of the Barrow Wight, like, took me by surprise. And I was like, whoa, what's going to happen? Like, you know? And speaking of that, they did not include in the movie anything about Tom Bombadil.
I know.
Who is this character who lives in this really dark forest that is menacing and evil. And, like, this tree tries to swallow, like, one of the hobbits. And he, like, sets him free and he takes him to his house. And basically, he's something like a god, but not totally. And the ring has absolutely no effect on him. And all of the people in the book, the ring would have an effect on everyone, but it doesn't have an effect on him. And they actually bring him up in the Council of Elrond, which is my favorite part of the book. They bring him up because they're like, well, who should take the ring to destroy it? And someone was like, well, why don't we just have Tom Bombadil, because it doesn't bother him. And I can't remember the reasons they come up for that. Something like he wouldn't leave. He had his orders or his duty to be in the woods or something like that.
And also he was living with this lady who could like control water, and
I think she was his wife.
Yeah, like
some
his
goddess?
wife question mark. And she was also super mysterious, even more mysterious than he was. And Tolkien did not really explain these characters.
So anyway, my two favorite moments were the Council of Elrond and meeting Aragorn, but also I really liked the Tom Bombadil one.
Mm-hmm.
I love meeting Eric Strider in the inn at Bree. That's just a great scene in general.
Yes.
Especially how Sam is so suspicious of him.
I love Sam. I love how like suspicious, and he's very clever. Apparently he like thinks a little slow, but he'll come to it. Like he'll eventually figure out like a really, and honestly, I think he's probably just smarter than me. So I have a deep, healthy respect for Sam.
Sam is great. Speaking of Sam, favorite characters, Sam surprisingly is my favorite character. I thought for sure it was going to be Aragorn because he was my favorite in the movies.
Who is your... Wait, did you say your favorite character was Gandalf?
I don't know. My two favorite characters in the whole book are like... They're not my favorite because of this book. So in this specific part, I don't really know who my favorite is. I love Galadriel. I love Gandalf. I honestly quite like Frodo. I don't know. Probably Gandalf or Galadriel is my favorite. I do love Gandalf. He's just so funny to me. And I love his, like, wisdom paired with his impatience. I really do. It's a good combination.
Yeah, you know, that one's really interesting to me because Psalms or Proverbs talks all about how wisdom and patience go hand in hand. And that if you have patience, you'll get understanding and therefore wisdom. So I think it's an interesting dichotomy in Gandalf where he's apparently super wise, but he is also quite impatient. I think he's definitely wise, but I think Gandalf is like really intelligent, and And that's why, like, he has less patience. And his wisdom does curb it, but sometimes he lets himself go a little bit. Because he's just so quick and he just wants people to get it. And, you know, sometimes he slips out of understanding.
Do you have a favorite character?
My favorite character is... I don't know. It's really hard. I know for a fact in the second book, my favorite character is Gollum, for sure. But I guess I would have to say it's a toss-up between Aragorn and Gandalf. I love the mastery, the self-mastery that Aragorn has on himself. And he's super capable, super intelligent, but he's also extremely wise, and he has a lot of the patience that Gandalf lacks. So it might just be Aragorn, but I also love the quirkiness of Gandalf. I thought it was super cool to listen to, or to read, Gandalf and Aragorn, like, co-lead these people to the first part of the journey.
Yes.
Because Gandalf will be like, well, what do you think? And Aragorn's like, you know what I think. You know? And he's like, yeah, well, you know, and they usually went Gandalf's way, and sometimes Aragorn was, like, not happy with the plan, and sometimes Gandalf, like, didn't think that Aragorn, you know, even though they were both super knowledgeable about the terrain that they were going through, and they were trying to figure out the best ways, and, you know, it was the fact that they were going with such a large party, trying to be completely secret, going at night, you know, traversing at night, not being able to see footing and, like, all that jazz, that, like, just really threw these complications in their way as guides. And I really just liked seeing two men that I respected disagree and agree and talk things out, like, that were complicated, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. I didn't find the quote, so I'll just read, like, a good moment that I know exactly where it is because it's at the end of the book.
About your character?
Yes.
Okay.
Of all the confounded nuisances, you are the worst, Sam, Frodo said. And this is right after Sam dives into the river to catch up with Frodo, because Frodo's trying to make an escape from the Fellowship because he feels that he should bear this burden of the ring alone. And Sam jumps into the river and he's about to drown, so Frodo is forced to save him. Oh, Mr. Frodo, that's hard, said Sam, shivering. That's hard, trying to go without me and all. If I hadn't guessed right, where would you be now? Safely on my way. Safely, said Sam. All alone and without me to help you? I couldn't have borne it. It'd have been the death of me. It would have been the death of you to come with me, Sam, said Frodo. And I could not have borne that. Not as certain as being left behind, said Sam. But I am going to Mordor. I know that well enough, Mr. Frodo, of course you are, and I'm coming with you. So that's just to explain how loyal Sam is. And I love how suspicious Sam can be of people. Like, it's not a characteristic you'd expect of him. But it is very consistent. And yeah, Sam is like he's surprisingly wise. He's not like smart, but he's surprisingly wise.
I think he's smart.
But actually you're right. He is smart because in that part where they're all scrambling out and trying to find where Frodo went because he disappeared without them, Sam is trying to catch up with Aragorn, and Aragorn's a lot faster than him, so he's like, all right, Sam, catch your breath now, Sam Gamgee. Okay, what are we gonna do now? And he's like, well, I can't catch up to Aragorn, so I'll start using my brains instead of my brawn. And he's like, now think, where would Frodo go? Well, he can't go long without food and clothes, and all of those are back at the boats, so he might be going back to the boats. So then he runs down to the river, and one of the boats is, like, pulling out into the river, and Frodo has the ring on, so he can't see Frodo pulling it out. So it looks very mysterious, but he knows Frodo's there, so he's like, Frodo, I'm coming! And just starts running at him. So anyway, yeah, I just love Sam.
That's awesome.
Thank you for listening to the 12th episode of the Two Retired Homeschoolers.
Rebecca, you want to know something?
Oh, what?
Did you know it only takes 10 reviews on Spotify to get a rating?
Whoa, no, I did not.
Do you know how long it takes to give a review on our podcast?
I don't know, like 3 hours?
Nope, only about 2 seconds.
Wow. That's so easy.
Isn't it crazy that our listeners could help us out so significantly with just 2 seconds, of their time?
This entire soliloquy of mine better make it into the podcast. Anyway.
I can finally see myself. For some reason, this call lets me see myself, and this is the most unflattering angle ever.